My name is Naomi Ellison. I was 31 when I finally understood that some families don't just play favorites. They slowly rewrite the past until one child starts doubting her own memories. The morning everything changed, I stood in my apartment kitchen with a mug of hot tea warming my hands. My other hand rested on the faintest curve of my stomach. Just 2 days earlier, my doctor had confirmed I was pregnant. Only Ethan, my husband, knew. Every time our eyes met, we smiled without saying a word. The happiness felt too big for language. Outside, rain drummed softly against the windows. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Family dinner. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. No, how are you? No smiley face. Just another instruction. That was normal. In my family, everything seemed to revolve around my older sister, Claire. She was the gifted one, the charming one, the person everyone admired without question. The story had been repeated so many times that it became less of an opinion and more of a family truth. I learned early that my place was somewhere in the background. When Claire won an art competition at 16, her framed certificate hung proudly in our hallway for years. When I graduated at the top of my university class, my diploma sat against the back of a closet for months because no one ever got around to framing it. They were small things, easy to dismiss on their own. But enough small disappointments eventually become heavy. They settle inside you like stones, weighing down every step. Even after I moved away, I never stopped showing up. I answered every phone call. I remembered every birthday. When Dad struggled with online forms or medical appointments, I was the one who sorted everything out. Every Christmas, I wrapped everyone's presents while Claire swept in late with an expensive dessert, somehow collecting all the compliments before dinner had even started. Sometimes I wondered if dependable love simply disappeared because people expected it to always be there. Ethan saw what I refused to admit. One evening, after watching me spend 3 hours baking desserts for another family gathering, he gently took my hand. "You don't have to keep proving you're worthy," he said. I smiled and brushed it off. But that night, lying beside him in the dark, his words refused to leave me. Maybe I had spent my whole life chasing approval that was never really mine to earn. Then, everything changed. The pregnancy gave me a new perspective. For the first time, my future wasn't just about me. Someone else was depending on me now. One day, my child would learn what family looked like by watching the people I called my own. As I carefully tucked the ultrasound photo into my journal, I made myself a quiet promise. My child would never grow up wondering if they were enough. I slipped the journal into my bag and headed out for dinner, completely unaware that before the evening was over, one conversation would uncover a secret my parents had buried for years. And once the truth came out, nothing about my family would ever make sense in the same way again. My parents' dining room looked almost exactly the way I remembered it from my teenage years. The polished oak table caught the warm glow of the light overhead, while the old clock in the corner kept its steady rhythm. Some places seem frozen in time, even when the people inside them have changed. Claire breezed in 15 minutes late, laughing as she stepped through the door. My mother rushed over to hug her, gently brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as though she were still a little girl instead of a 30-year-old woman. My father's face lit up with the biggest smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "Now we can eat," he said warmly. Across the table, Ethan caught my eye and reached for my hand beneath the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Dinner unfolded the way it always did. The conversation revolved around Claire, her recent promotion, her beautiful new apartment, her exciting plans for the future. Every story led to another compliment, and every compliment seemed to invite another reason to admire her. I listened quietly until I realized my heart was pounding. "I have some news," I said, breaking into the conversation. The room fell silent. Ethan smiled, unable to contain his excitement. "We're having a baby." For a brief moment, no one reacted. Then my father offered a small, polite smile. My mother gave a slow nod, but I couldn't read her expression. Claire stopped mid-bite, her fork suspended in the air. "The first grandchild," Ethan added, his voice filled with happiness. I had expected surprise. Maybe laughter. Maybe tears. At the very least, congratulations. Instead, my mother's smile faded almost as quickly as it had appeared. She looked at my father. He looked back at her. It wasn't a casual glance. It was quick, familiar, like they had shared that silent conversation many times before. Claire lowered her eyes to her plate. No one said a word. The silence felt heavier than any shouting match. After several long seconds, my mother cleared her throat. Perhaps we should talk about this privately after dinner. A knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't her words that unsettled me. It was the unmistakable feeling that everyone else already knew what this conversation was going to be about. For the first time in years, I stopped searching for excuses or explanations. I simply watched. And once I did, I noticed things I'd somehow overlooked my entire life. My father's fingers tapped nervously against the edge of the table. Claire refused to look at me. Beside my mother's chair sat a sealed envelope with our family name written neatly across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of it sent a chill through me. Somehow, I knew that envelope and whatever was inside it had been waiting for this exact moment. Dinner lingered long after the last bite had been eaten, as if everyone believed clearing plates and topping off glasses could delay what was coming. Ethan offered to help my mother in the kitchen, but she gently shook her head. "Why don't you wait in the living room with your father?" she said. Her tone was polite, but something about it felt rehearsed. Ethan looked at me for a moment before reluctantly leaving the room. Claire stayed where she was, absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her glass with one finger. She never once looked in my direction. My mother reached for the unopened envelope. She held it in both hands, staring at it for several long seconds before speaking. "There are things you don't understand," she said quietly. I met her eyes. "Then help me understand." She drew a slow breath. It was the first time I could remember seeing her hesitate, as though the words she'd guarded for years suddenly refused to come. "We've always believed Claire should have the first opportunity to build this family." The sentence hung in the air. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. What does that have to do with my pregnancy? Silence. No one answered. Finally, my father spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Timing matters." For a moment, I almost laughed, not because anything was amusing, but because his explanation made no sense at all. This wasn't a race. My pregnancy wasn't something that could be postponed until it fit someone else's plans. Claire finally broke the silence. "I never asked for any of this," she whispered. When I looked at her, her eyes were filled with tears. For the first time that night, I didn't see the sister who had always been placed on a pedestal. I saw a woman carrying a weight she had never chosen for herself. My mother's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were neatly folded letters, copies of financial records, and a faded handwritten note that looked as though it had been tucked away for years. She didn't offer them to me. She simply stared at the papers, her expression distant, as if the memories they carried had grown heavier with time. "We made promises," she said softly. "To whom?" I asked. She never answered. Instead, she carefully gathered the documents, slipped them back into the envelope, and closed it again. That silence spoke louder than any explanation could have. Whatever had shaped our family all these years wasn't just an unspoken understanding. It had been put in writing. It had been signed, hidden away. And now, with the news of my pregnancy, the truth was beginning to come apart. I hardly slept that night. Every time I drifted off, I pictured the envelope in my mother's hands. By then, it was more than a stack of old papers. It had become evidence that the story I'd grown up believing was incomplete, that whole pieces of it had been hidden from me. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Can we meet?" "Just us." We met at a quiet cafe across town, the same place we used to stop after school before adulthood, distance, and unspoken expectations changed everything. She looked exhausted. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. "I owe you the truth," she said softly. I didn't interrupt. I simply waited. When I was 22, Mom and Dad asked me to make a promise. Her eyes drifted toward the window. They said our family had to protect a secret. They believed everything depended on keeping it. I felt my chest tighten. "What secret?" She swallowed before answering. They never told me I could tell you. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us didn't feel angry. It felt heartbreaking. I never wanted them to compare us, Claire finally said. Every time they praised me, I knew it came at your expense. I asked them to stop more than once, but they never listened. Hearing those words caught me off guard. For the first time in my life, someone had finally spoken aloud what I'd been feeling for years. Claire reached into her bag and placed a small brass key on the table between us. I found this hidden inside Dad's old desk years ago, she said. It was taped underneath one of the drawers. Mom caught me with it and told me never to open the box it belongs to. I picked up the key and turned it over in my fingers. Years of use had worn its edges smooth. Near the top, a tiny number was engraved into the brass. Do you know what's inside the box?
I asked.
She slowly shook her head.
No.
But I've always believed the box and that envelope are connected. I slipped the key into my pocket just as my phone vibrated again. Another message from my mother. Please come home tonight. Before someone else gets there. I read the text a second time. Before someone else. A chill ran through me. Until that moment, I'd thought my parents were simply trying to keep the truth buried. Now I realized they were racing against someone who might uncover it first. By the time Ethan and I pulled into my parents' driveway, the sun was dipping below the rooftops, casting long streaks of golden light across the lawn. The house looked exactly as it always had, yet something about it felt different. Tense. Almost as if it had been waiting for us all day. Before I could knock, the front door opened. You came, my mother said softly. There was no smile. No, I'm glad you're here. Just unmistakable relief. As we stepped inside, the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books drifted through the hallway. It was the smell of my childhood, a smell that had once made me feel safe. Now it only reminded me how much had been left unsaid. My father stood by the fireplace, absent-mindedly turning his wedding ring around his finger. Claire was already there, staring silently at the floor. Without saying a word, my mother led us upstairs to the study. In the corner sat the old wooden chest I'd known since I was a child. Growing up, I had always been told it held nothing more than family keepsakes. Somehow, no one had ever opened it while I was in the room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key Claire had given me. My heart pounded as I slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. A soft click broke the silence. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside were carefully bundled letters tied with faded ribbon, stacks of old photographs, and a leather-bound journal with worn, weathered edges. Resting on top was a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in elegant handwriting I didn't recognize. I looked up. My father's eyes had filled with tears. We should have given that to you years ago, he said, his voice barely steady. My hands shook as I broke the seal. I unfolded the letter. The very first sentence stole the breath from my lungs. If you are reading this, it means the time has finally come for our family's promise to end. I looked at the signature. It wasn't my mother's. It wasn't my father's. It belonged to the last person I ever expected to see, a name tied to an absence that had quietly shaped our family for years without me ever realizing it. In that instant, my mother's text message finally made sense. Before someone else gets there. The truth wasn't waiting inside this house anymore. It was already on its way. My grip tightened around the letter as the room fell completely silent. The handwriting was neat and steady, carrying an unexpected warmth. It felt as though the person who had written it hoped these words would someday bring peace instead of pain. Dear Naomi, if this letter has found its way to you, then I am no longer here to explain these choices myself. All I ask is that you read to the end before deciding what to believe. I froze when I reached the signature. Margaret Ellison, my grandmother. I'd always been told she died when I was too young to remember her. Whenever her name came up, the conversation was brief and carefully controlled, as though lingering on her memory might uncover something everyone preferred to leave buried. I turned to the next page. Years earlier, my grandmother had established a family trust. It was never meant to favor one grandchild over another. Instead, It was intended to support whichever descendant built a life guided by kindness, responsibility, and integrity. There were no requirements about career success. No expectations about marriage. Not even a condition about having children. Only character mattered. She believed money should never become a substitute for love, or a way to measure a person's worth. Tucked behind that letter was another, addressed to my parents. Do not let comparison become your inheritance. If either daughter grows up believing love must be earned, then you have misunderstood everything I hope to leave behind. The words hit me harder than I expected, because that was exactly what had happened. My father lowered his head. We thought we were protecting the family, he said quietly. Your grandmother trusted us to look after the trust until the time was right. Somewhere along the way, we stopped protecting it and started trying to control it. Beside him, my mother wiped tears from her cheeks. We convinced ourselves Claire needed to succeed first, she admitted. We kept telling ourselves the family would stay together if everyone followed the plan. Claire slowly shook her head. There was never a plan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was only fear. Silence settled over the room once again. But this time it felt different. No one was making excuses.
No one was trying to rewrite the past.
For the first time, we were simply facing it together, with nothing left to hide. Then the sharp chime of the front doorbell broke the silence. Every head turned toward the hallway. The color drained from my mother's face. Barely above a whisper, she said, "They're here." For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then the doorbell rang again. This time it was followed by a gentle, unhurried knock. It wasn't the knock of someone demanding to be let in. It sounded like someone who had waited a long time and was certain the moment had finally arrived. My father drew a slow breath before heading downstairs. The rest of us followed without a word. When he opened the front door, an elderly woman stood on the porch beside a man carrying a slim leather briefcase. She leaned lightly on a cane, and the fading evening light shimmered against her silver hair. The moment her eyes met mine, she smiled. "You must be Naomi." I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said warmly. "I was Margaret's closest friend. She asked me to deliver one final message when the time was right." The man beside her introduced himself as the trustee who had carried out my grandmother's wishes for years. He set the briefcase on the dining room table, unlocked it, and carefully removed a thick folder. Inside were neatly organized documents, each one signed and dated years before my grandmother passed away. The trust had never concealed the truth. Only my family had. Evelyn unfolded a handwritten note and began to read. Margaret believed that families are truly tested when love becomes confused with possession. She wanted both of her granddaughters to have the same opportunities, but only after they were free to choose their own lives. The room was silent. Claire reached over and gently took my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For too long, staying silent felt easier than telling the truth." I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I know." In that moment, something inside me shifted. Claire had never been my competition. She had spent years trapped beneath expectations she never asked for, while I had spent just as long searching for answers no one was willing to give. Across the room, my parents sat side by side, their faces marked by quiet regret. They couldn't erase the years we'd lost. They couldn't undo the choices they'd made. But for the first time, they stopped trying to justify them. Outside, evenings settled gently over the neighborhood. Inside, the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Now there was only one thing left to do. Decide what kind of family we wanted to become now that honesty had finally replaced fear. The next morning, sunlight poured through my parents' living room windows, casting a warm glow over photographs that had hung on those walls for as long as I could remember. For the first time, I noticed something I had somehow missed all these years. There were countless pictures of our family, but very few of all of us together. My mother stood beside me, holding an empty picture frame she had tucked away in a cabinet years before. "I kept telling myself there would be a better time," she said quietly. "A better moment to fix everything." I gave her a small, bittersweet smile. Sometimes waiting becomes a choice. She lowered her eyes and nodded. There was nothing she could say to disagree. The months that followed weren't marked by dramatic changes or perfect endings. Healing rarely works that way. Trust doesn't return the moment someone says, "I'm sorry." It grows back slowly in ordinary moments, phone calls that begin with, "How are you feeling?" instead of, "Can you help us?" Visits without comparisons. Conversations where honesty replaces the silence that once filled every room. Claire and I started meeting for lunch every few weeks. Gradually, our conversations shifted. We spent less time trying to untangle the past and more time imagining the future. Somewhere along the way, we realized we'd both been trying to become the daughters we thought our parents wanted, instead of the women we were meant to be. When my baby was born, my parents came to the hospital with no grand speeches, no expectations, and no carefully rehearsed apologies. My father simply looked down at his grandchild, his eyes shining with quiet emotion. Then he whispered, "May you never have to earn the love that's already yours." Those words healed something inside me that no inheritance ever could. A few months later, I picked up my grandmother's journal from the bookshelf. Pressed between its pages was a faded wildflower she had collected decades earlier. Beneath it, in her careful handwriting, was a single sentence. "The strongest families are not the ones that never break. They are the ones brave enough to tell the truth before another generation inherits the silence." I closed the journal and looked across the room at my child, sleeping peacefully beside the window as soft afternoon sunlight filled the nursery. In that quiet moment, everything became clear. The greatest gift my grandmother left us wasn't the family trust. It was the courage to bring an end to a legacy of comparison and begin a new one where every child grows up knowing, without a doubt, that they have always been enough. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of Naomi's story. If it resonated with you, I hope it leaves you with one simple reminder: real strength isn't found in revenge. It's found in honesty, healing, and having the courage to break the cycles that no longer deserve a place in our lives. If you enjoyed the story, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys heartfelt family dramas. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What moment in Naomi's journey stayed with you the most? And if you were in her place, what would you have done differently? Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care of yourself, be kind to the people who truly matter, and never let anyone else's comparison define your worth. You have always been enough.